Right, we're good to go. Excellent, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session. I hope you found that previous one inspiring. First time I heard that story, I thought, wow, that's something quite special. So the bar has been set, and I have a fantastic panel of people to help continue that level. So no pressure, guys. Just quickly, I'll let Stuart, Tara and Susannah introduce themselves, but the reason for this session is that we've had a number of members say, actually, can you just help us understand a bit more about what human rights is and how we really should be working it and why it's different. So we want to go through some of those questions. So I have a very knowledgeable, almost too knowledgeable panel that I've got the job of then trying to sort of rein them back and keep it simple. But I'll now let them introduce themselves. Tara.
Hi everybody, I'm Tara Norton. I'm Managing Director for Supply Chain Sustainability at BSR. I was previously, what feels like now so long ago, Managing Director of Sedex, and it's amazing to come back and see how well it's doing and so it's a real pleasure to be here today. And as David noted, a lot of conversations also from BSR members around how do we integrate human rights into our approach to supply chain sustainability or responsible sourcing. You know, what does this mean? How do these things come together? And so we've been working on practically how do you apply this. So I think that's why I'm on the panel today, David.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes, brilliant.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susannah McLaren, and I'm a business and human rights advisor with Shift. I actually only joined Shift back in November, so this is really my first time presenting myself as Shift. I've met quite a few of you before in my previous role where I was head of social sustainability with a global engineering services company. So very much moving from the in-house to the non-profit sector. It's quite a change, I have to say. For those of you who aren't familiar with Shift, we like to call ourselves the leading center of expertise on the UN Guiding Principles, and that's simply because our chair and co-founders were actually the key authors of the Guiding Principles, and our whole purpose and mission is to help implement those with companies, with business, civil society, and international institutions. Thanks.
Hi, Stuart, Neely. I'm a senior associate at Norton Fulbright, a law firm. I work in our business and human rights practice, which is part of our broader business ethics advisory practice.
Thank you very much. And just to explain quite a bit about what Stuart's doing there, Stuart works with Sam, who's part of our Stakeholder Forum Advisory Board. So again, input from a different sort of angle. So, just wanted to get the conversation going and understand a little bit about the level of knowledge in the room about human rights sort of issues. So I've got 3 questions. So if you could get your phones out, we'd just like to know the answers to. First of all, simple one, does your company actually have a human rights policy in place? And ideally, which covers supply chain matters, which is topical to what we're talking about today. About half and half. Okay, interesting. Good. Thank you. The next one, on a similar sort of vein. Human rights impact assessment. Do you understand what that is? How many of you have done them? Just again, trying to get a bit of understanding. We'll come back to that. Perhaps a little bit soon to be talking about human rights impact assessments. Okay, useful. Grievance mechanisms. Is that language that's familiar or not? About half for your suppliers as well. That's interesting. So if a small proportion have done impact assessments, it'd be interesting to then link that to how you know which suppliers to be looking at when you're looking at the grievance mechanisms. But we'll come back to that. So to get the conversation going, I'd like to bring the panel in really with a question to start, which is how does human rights and a human rights approach to social compliance and assurance differ from the normal sort of social audit type thing that many companies will be used to? What in simple terms is the difference?
I can start on that one. I think basically, I mean, it boils down on a practical level, I think, to companies who have been looking at their massive supply chains and saying, how do we prioritize, what we're going to do in our, in terms of social compliance, and actually starting by saying, where sort of traditional approaches have looked at risk from the perspective of country risk, from the perspective of category risk, and then also adding a layer of spend. That was sort of the traditional approach of saying, where do we have the most influence? So we're going to look at, where are our biggest risks and where do we have the most influence? The shift, when you think about it from a human rights perspective, is actually spend plays no role in it, really. It's about the risk to the rights holder. And so it means in terms of how you're gearing your program to start out, you're gearing it towards where is there likely to be risk in my supply chain to the rights holders, where is that likely to be the most present?
So just to jump in there, because there's a very important term in there, which is rights holder. Yeah, important starting point for human rights. Mm-hmm. Often if you're looking at social impact assessments, it's about a factory, a site, and the people who work on that site, whereas rights holders is a much broader constituency. So their number one difference, rights holders versus a site.
Yeah, and I might turn to, maybe there's a legal point of view on rights holder as a definition before we move on.
Sure.
Is there? I don't know.
By virtue of humanity, you have the human rights. So
That's
I think so. And that probably goes to the number of it, and potentially maybe that relieves you as to what I might have said as the lawyer on the panel in terms of sort of any disagreement. And there wouldn't be any disagreement from me on anything that you've said. I think when you talk about a normal sort of social assurance process, or what you were terming that, I mean, it presupposes a benchmark standard. So whether that's the ETI-based code or anything like that, it essentially says I am going to look at either my business internally, perhaps with the internal audit function or with the support of someone like BSR, some sort of external advisory help, or I look at my business partners, but I'm still working towards a benchmark standard which is what I'm measuring against. I think human rights due diligence by its nature sort of starts a step earlier. So the assurance process is a component, but human rights due diligence, and I don't want to sort of step on too much what Susannah might say in terms of the UN guiding principles, but clearly the actual initial process of identifying the actual potential human rights impact is the starting point,
Slow down. There's a lot of new terms in there. So due diligence and impacts and all those sort of things. Just kind of bring you back to that first question about, so what's different then to human rights as opposed to a normal social assurance process that companies will be used to?
So I think, to put it bluntly, I see it as a component of it, but ultimately, sort of perhaps the defining criteria of human rights due diligence, although there may be more, is that you could argue it's a standard of conduct which is outcomes-based, insofar as you measure the effectiveness of your human rights due diligence process by the extent to which you can identify the key human rights issues and then respond to them.
So without opening an entire can of worms, a human rights due diligence process, because that might be a phrase that's new to people.
Would you like to pick that up?
Yeah, that's a good
I can help.
And how is that different from a normal sort of social assurance process?
Okay, so I think I wouldn't call one different to the other. What I would call it, I would say a human rights approach is a natural evolution on moving on from a purely compliance audit-based approach, and it's really born out of a recognition that I don't think we've seen that it hasn't worked solely if we just focus on the compliance angle. So it's more of an evolution towards a broader approach, and that's, I think, if you wanted to say a difference, is that a human rights approach, or if you want to term it a human rights due diligence approach, is a much more holistic way of looking at things that really seeks, and where it goes further is it seeks to address the root cause, and it also seeks to really focus on areas that where you can actually drive action. If you want, in essence, I mean, a simple way of looking at it.
Anyway.
In Shift, we have a wheel that we use that some of the people in this room have been at our workshops and we've presented, which is identify and assess, action, so addressing it, tracking it, tracking a measurement, reporting it, and sort of encompassed in all that you would have engaging with your stakeholders. So if you want to think of it in simple questions, it's what impacts am I associated with? What action do I need to take? How do I know if it's working? Who should I be open with?
But don't we
And
do that already in
who
the
should-
social assurance process?
Yes, you do.
Because we understand where our
But-
risks are and we
but-
ask some questions and we follow up. So what's different then about the
Okay,
human rights
so
approach?
I think one of the real differences that we've noted is in comparison to traditional points, and this is something that was introduced as a real paradigm shift as part of the guiding principles, is this risk starting from the lens of risk to people rather than the lens of risk to business. They will converge in many occasions because, where you have risk to people, it's likely to turn into a business risk. But where that differs is that you might have, if you don't, so that means that you're looking much broader than your first tier. And many people will think, oh no, that means auditing all the way down my supply chain.
Yeah.
And that's where where the guiding principles is not saying that.
Yeah.
It's saying looking broader, looking beyond your first tier to see where your impacts may arise. And they may arise, and most, this, if we think about it, the 21 million people who are in forced and bonded labor, the 73 children working in hazardous work, those are not necessarily happening in your first year. They're more likely to be happening further down in the remotest parts of your supply chain.
Okay.
And a due diligence approach really seeks to look for those risks there. And so even if it's your small supplier, way down your supply chain, that if you know that there are poor practices there, then that is where there might be that impact. So just to give an example, if we think about the case of the Thai shrimp industry and the fishing boats, many of the big brands hadn't thought to look that far, and actually it only got exposed via The Guardian.
So
Well,
just to
sorry.
recap as we go along.
Yeah, go ahead.
One, it's about everybody, so rights holders, as opposed to just the factories you're
That's right.
auditing. Two, it's about not just the first tier, but there's an expectation based around cause, contribute, linked to, that it's further down your supply chain, but there's different effects through there. So we've got two differences so far. Good.
Well, I think
Stuart?
just
Sorry.
just to add on that, I think, but just to, because that can feel very overwhelming, because then we're talking about everything everywhere. But I still think, and I think you're making a very good point, it's really about, a lot of this is founded on, do you understand your supply chain, to the nth degree?
Yep.
And the pressure on business has always been to understand more and more, and certainly we're seeing more of that in terms of things companies are doing already, and even more so, but looking at traceability of product and understanding provenance of things and all of this. And so that is a clear foundation, is just trying to understand as much as possible at what is happening throughout the multiple tiers of your supply chain, within reason.
Yep.
Nobody's expecting you to necessarily be able to trace everything back to the very start of everything.
But how do I know where to look? Because I'm told all human rights are equal. So
I think,
how do you prioritize?
Well, but the second, just one other point, because I think the other thing is, it's also important to note we're not only talking about workers. I think we've made this point, but it's
Rights
people,
holders,
it's rights holders, and so that could mean, for example, the community around a certain part of your supply chain, which I think is a very important clarification.
Good.
So just 2 points, and I'll pick on that point briefly. I think the word you use is holistic, and I think that's a really good word to use, because actually the notion of some audits, particularly when you've got the preset criteria, is that it can be quite process-driven. And if you follow the process and you don't identify any issues, then everyone moves on. The fundamental nature of the UN Guiding Principles due diligence under Guiding Principle 17 is that if you fail to identify your key human rights issues, then that potentially says something about the process that you're following and your human rights governance and your human rights processes. In terms of this issue of all things to all people and finite resources, the Guiding Principles do recognize that businesses have finite resources, and you have to have regard to the size of the organization and the complexity of the operations. The best example, very briefly, I can think of, which always comes up, it's quite old actually, it was Afromex, which was in sort of 2007. It was a UK National Contact Point complaint. And Afromex is quite a small mining company, but it was operating in Eastern DRC. So the UK National Contact Point concluded, do you know what, at that stage, asking for assurances from your suppliers is not enough, and it doesn't matter that you're small, because it's about size and complexity.
And if I can add about that,
Sure.
it really is about getting beyond the traditional approach of audit and really looking at what relationships you can forge to be able to collaboratively solve the issues. I mean, it's not expecting every company to solve for itself, and this is possibly where many businesses feel quite uncomfortable. So if it's coming together with your peers in your sector, your competitors, in some sectors that still doesn't happen. Of course, we have some excellent examples of where it does. If it's having difficult conversations in government with governments, especially ones that don't want to talk about these issues. So it's really it's thinking, and in Shift we use the word a lot, and it's obviously in the principles as well. It's about leverage. But it's also about creativity.
Yeah.
Creativity is really important, thinking about ways that you can get to the issue without, without necessarily always having to fall on the assurance process. It's not sustainable anyway, especially to move down the chain.
So we've got rights holders as opposed to just sites. We've got the full supply chain rather than just your tier one. We've got prioritising it through what we call an impact assessment and working out where your highest risks are. Is that it?
Based on the severity to people.
Of course, yeah.
Very important, rather than... Another area which, and there are some good initial examples around this, is really looking... So the guiding principles are all about, looking at how a company's activities might contribute towards human rights impact along the value chain. And we're talking about supply chain, which we also have to think, up the value chain as well, but that's another conversation. Sure. So another thing is about things like looking at your purchasing practices, which unfortunately I haven't been at the conference, but in the past 2 days, but I'm sure it's been spoken about, your purchasing practices do impact upon your suppliers, obviously. If you're constantly trying to drive down the price, or you're setting timescales that are unrealistic or changing them, that can contribute towards overtime. It can lead the supplier to bring in casual labor that has all the other issues. Okay. So looking at your purchasing practices, is part of the responsibility as well of the human rights due diligence approach.
And in talking to someone just before we came, they said there's this pillar about remedy. That's another sort of word that's different. What's that, and is that significantly different to what we would do with corrective action plans, or is that actually just what it is?
Well, can I just step in there, because I have worked with a number of companies, and I'm going to say this here, and I am consistently amazed at the amount of non-compliances that are not being followed up and closed off. Okay. So even before we get to remedy, and even before we get into talking about anything new, please, can we make some effort on, whether collaboratively through a system like Sedex, which is part of the reason that Sedex is established, really work on closing off those outstanding issues. And I realize there's complexity around that, but I just think there's so much low-hanging fruit, to use a really annoying term, to just actually focus on the things that we can see and we know are issues. So
would that meet that obligation to provide remedy, just closing non-compliances?
I'm going to turn to our legal expert again on that.
I was expecting you might do that. So the remedy is the third pillar, as you point out, and it is often referred to as the neglected pillar. Because and there is some research being done by the likes of the British Institute for International Comparative Law and others to really assess what remedy means and how businesses can better approach this issue of remedy. And
in simplistic terms, that is?
Effectively, we talk about non-judicial operational level grievance mechanisms, which is essentially... I was getting there. Which is essentially where the company takes it upon itself to decide through the process of realizing there has been an impact. So we're no longer talking about potential impacts here, we're talking about an actual impact has arisen. How to respond to that. And the gamut here is potentially huge, and recognizing actually when it is appropriate for authorities to be involved. So a good example is, on the one end, if a mining company runs over someone's goat, that is an example of where an operational level grievance mechanism would be perfectly appropriate, in the sense that the company can recompense that person for the amount that the goat was worth. But if you're dealing with risk to life and those sorts of issues, clearly you would say it's not appropriate for the company to be handling that.
So you mentioned a grievance mechanism there. Is having a grievance mechanism enough to say we provide access to remedy, for example?
It needs to be operationalized, which
it needs to be shown to be effective, but is that pretty much it?
I think you're keen to jump in, but I think one of the principal problem with remedy is determining effectively you're dealing with vulnerable persons here, and I think the level of expertise at the moment is low in terms of how to approach that within the companies.
Okay.
Okay, so I think from maybe a less legal sort of terminology, remedy is really putting right something that's gone wrong. So where a company acknowledges that it has had a negative impact, then it has a responsibility to put that right. I mean, it obviously depends on the type of impact. So obviously, if we're talking about a situation of discrimination, that could be a company reinstating a person who maybe they fired through discrimination. So reinstating that person, possibly compensating them for what the loss of confidence, for instance, they may have, and looking to change their policy so that doesn't happen again. If you're talking about a situation where your effluent has impacted the river's water quality, and then a local village has been impacted, then that remedy is much harder to put right.
If these are just guiding principles, how can anyone be then expected to pay up anything? Because it's not a legal obligation.
Okay, so the guiding principles talks about cause, contribution, and linkage.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really expecting to get into that today because it's actually, not the
example.
easiest topic.
Isn't this just guidance, which is nice and best practice?
The guiding principles. Well, the guiding principles are David is being very provocative. The guiding principles are now being, and increasingly so, put into law effectively through, for example, the French law, Devoir de Vigilance. You could argue that the UK Modern Slavery Act in certain ways is taking, some of this. There's any number of legal, I'm going to turn to my legal expert, but there's any number of laws that are coming into play that are using the guiding principles effectively as the basis for that.
And so, if I can build on that, because that's actually really helpful. When we're talking about a human rights due diligence approach, most of you are probably facing the different laws that Tara helpfully mentioned. And actually, they may seem very different because you've got the Modern Slavery Act that's focused on a single issue. You've got the French law that is much broader on human rights due diligence. But actually, all of them speak to the principles of the guiding principle. And what they're looking for is that you implement a robust human rights due diligence process, so this holistic process, that you're focusing on your most severe impacts from the perspective of the rights holder, and that you have the grievance mechanisms in place. So you're in listening mode, and you have ways to capture where the voices of communities and workers when things go wrong.
Okay.
So by having an approach like that, you can actually get at all the laws. You don't have to have different approaches tailored towards different laws.
So we're talking about rights holders rather than just a site. We're talking about full supply chain, understand your impacts through that supply chain and which are the most significant, and providing some way of fixing those.
So, just picking up, because I think we've linked two things which I was hoping to talk about quite well there. First is on remedy. Guiding Principle 31 is the place to go. It has the effectiveness criteria for remedy.
You heard that here.
It needs to be predictable. It needs to be transparent. And you're dealing with people of different cultures and different languages. And ultimately, this is from the perspective of the people who are participating in the system rather than from sort of the London perspective. And then on the transparency side of things, which we pick up in the Modern Slavery Act, the French Duty Vigilance Law, and the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which, by the way, has got nowhere near the attention it should have done. It's a very interesting piece of law which requires listed entities with over 500 employees or financial institutions, credit institutions or insurers to report on their human rights issues, following the process of inward reflection that the guiding principles would require, and the policies they have in place. Now that has to go in the annual returns, which obviously means it needs board sign-off, which means it needs senior board management reflecting on human rights at a very senior level.
Which kind of brings me into the next question, which is, aren't we doing this anywhere, and why do we do it now? So what's driving it? And I sense part of that is actually there's a lot of legislation coming through that's forcing us to do it more than we ever had before. But is it not just what we're already doing?
I think partially.
Partially, yeah.
I think partially it's increasing scrutiny from stakeholders and the regulation around transparency requiring companies to say and do more, which is mutually enforcing. And reinforcing. Yeah,
and actually effectively, in France, I live in France, I have a little bit, not enough, but I have a little bit more of an insight. When the French law came into practice, that was essentially driven by more or less one NGO in France that just had a lot of outsized influence. So to your point, I think some of this is also, and maybe you can speak to this, that the UNGP sort of really gave more credence to the importance of this issue, and I think gave more therefore, I don't know, fuel to NGOs to be really much more active on this.
Okay.
And so kind of there is a line, yes, there is more legislation, but there's also, as you said, more pressure from NGOs, so it's sort of all coming together.
But I'd say that the guiding principles also really established what business responsibility role was in terms of...
In a way that had been never defined before.
Exactly, in a way, and also that, you know, there was, I mean, I wasn't involved in that process, but I was following it, and, you know, the NGOs probably wanted everything to be within businesses' remit. What the guiding principles and what some people don't necessarily appreciate is actually put some boundaries.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we haven't talked about enough, you sort of alluded to it, but we haven't talked enough detail, is really that they are quite helpful, because when you think, as you said, you know, aren't human rights all equal? Yes, they are, but and that is an issue for business, because it's sort of, if they're all equal, and where do I start to focus my attention?
And actually, the answer is?
And actually, the guiding principles do allow you to prioritize. They accept that business have limited resources. I mean, I come from a business background. I know what it entails, you know, to deal. For instance, I spent the past 3 years just on modern slavery. So, you know, you need to have a way of prioritizing. And the guiding principles provide some very strong ways, based on the principle of severity, that you can get to that, you know, by looking at scale, scope, remediability. I know these are all sort of, it sounds a bit too technical, but if you do look at it, and if you look at a more helpful document to look at, because guiding principles can be a bit overwhelming, is the guiding, the reporting framework on the guiding principles. And that actually presents the concept of salience. And salience is again talking about looking at your impact, where you have your impacts have the most harm to people and compromising human rights. And not to be confused with materiality, because it is a different concept. But by looking at that and showing that you have processes in place to identify those, that you've listened to your affected stakeholders, so not just your stakeholders in London who shout loudest, but really that you've got ways to hear from things on the ground, that you're prioritizing in the right way, that's pretty defendable as well.
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you one question first, which was, apart from the obvious excellent resources that your own individual companies have, where else would you point people to in terms of a way of understanding what to do in this sort of space, so that they can start to get their heads around it and deliver some stuff?
Well, I just realized I left something in my bag, which is Unilever's human rights report. It's just, I mean, I think looking to other companies that are leaders in the space who are doing really good work. As you said, I mean, just looking at Unilever, very good example of looking at their salient issues and working out with the czar and reporting on it.
Based on the Shift's human rights reporting framework.
I see it, but I'm not talking about my own work.
Yeah, you're allowed to do that.
It is a reporting framework that is open for everyone to use.
Right.
So
Indeed.
it's not like it's created by us, but it's everybody can go on. There's on the website. It's all available there. Other reports that you can look at: Coca-Cola, Heineken, H&M. They've all done their work based on salience. Yes, there were companies that we've worked with and we continue to work with, but they're companies that BSR are working with. You know,
does the report give you enough understanding of how to do the process?
I think for both Nestle and Coca-Cola really go into quite a lot of detail about how they've done it. I know that, for instance, Nestle then, subsequent to that, they're identifying their salient issues. They identified 12 salient issues. And not to get hung up on the number, you could identify fewer.
But it's a nice
but then they had
number,
action plans based on those. And you have to remember that many of the issues identified are programs that they have been working on already.
So they're just
evolving. So it doesn't mean like suddenly you have 12 massive programs. Some will might mean an upscale or a repositioning.
Good.
Just a couple of points in answer to your question. The first is interesting company names. I think, you know, they're very large companies. A proportion of the companies that you mentioned, and I won't say which ones, are clearly companies that have been associated historically with problems and scandals in the area of human rights. We did a study with the British Institute of International Comparative Law last year, which we published in the Cambridge Journal of Business and Human Rights. And one of the interesting things about that is we looked at 150 plus companies who we engaged with through surveys and interviews, and found that of those who've actually gone through the process of undertaking specific human rights due diligence with the aim of identifying human rights issues, 60% said to their mind that they had been associated with human rights scandals. So I think that's an interesting point to
crisis.
highlight in terms of the names that come
It's
up.
a good
That's the point.
driver, yeah.
And that's,
I mean,
and that sort of leads me to the point of why, and also your point about tools. I really wouldn't sort of underestimate the value of collective action. You can't. Businesses working together, you know, sort of 2 heads are better than 1, and sort of 10 heads are better than 2.
Good. Have we got some questions from
Can
the
I give a
audience?
few examples based on that? On the collective, if you don't.
Well, I've got
And
a couple
whilst we're
that
bringing those questions up, but
raise.
Oh, now we're questions from
Should
the
we
let's do
go for
let's do
questions or
questions
should
from
we-
the
okay.
audience.
wondering if there's any
Yeah.
questions from the audience that we can... Sam?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a favourite question of mine, and I'm a colleague of Stuart's, but this is all quite complicated. And
Yeah.
I'm listening
I'm trying to make it simple.
listening to Stuart talking, it is quite complicated. But what I'm observing, and I'm a relatively newcomer to this area, is that some companies are embracing this and embracing this really hard. My message to all of you is look at the outriders, and they will have more resources than many of the companies here, but look at what they're doing, ask yourself why they're doing it, and there is an element of competitive advantage which is emerging.
Yeah.
And then think ahead. So my question is, what are we looking at, say, in 5 years' time?
Interesting.
What is going to be the new norm?
Yeah.
And be realistic, because there are companies here
Yeah.
who can't possibly
Well, I think
expectation, but what's going to happen next?
I think it's a good point because I think one of the things that's been underpinning this whole discussion is, you know, I remember actually speaking to, I don't know if Joe McGuire's in the room, but I remember when the UNGPs were published, Joe McGuire gave me a call from Diageo. He said, aren't we doing all this anyway? I've been doing this for years. What's going on? And I think there is something about, in certain ways, this is giving a broader and a bigger name to what we've been doing for many years already. So I think, I mean, if I flash forward, I
So
think...
in 5 years.
Yeah, in 5 years, maybe 10 years, but all of this will be couched under human rights. We won't be talking about different approaches. We'll be talking about one approach. And the other thing that I hope happens, though, and I haven't worked this one out as well in my head, is that we still keep this holistic view of responsible sourcing, which also includes other aspects. But there is so much interrelationship between climate change and human rights. And so how those things are going to play out, I don't know. But I think we're playing for just a big, you know, this is all sort of converging. I think this may be the overall theme.
I can add to that. I mean, we're not all doing this. We are maybe in the room, but we're not all doing it to the extent that we should from a holistic perspective. I mean, I was just in Japan where we work with businesses there, and you know, being there gave them permission to even consider approaches where they would work together to talk about collective issues, because every company always felt it was their duty to look at this in an individual perspective. And, you know, it gave them permission to talk about being honest and open with their challenges and using examples like Unilever showing, you know, the issues that they... So we're not telling them you need to be the Unilever, you need to be the Coca-Cola, but you're bringing those ideas, and that collective action doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't happen in every sector. I mean, prior to joining Shift, I was involved together with some of Tara's colleagues at BSR with setting up a new collaboration of the engineering and construction sector called Business Responsibly. Building Responsibly. And I should know that. I spent enough time on it. But, you know, getting those engineering companies in the room to talk about challenges without that accepting would never happen.
Are there any examples of small companies who are doing it well? Because it's easy to go and read some of those, but I think for the companies in the room, if there are some small companies, are there any of those?
What do you mean by small companies?
Well, not the multinationals that are the Unilevers, Nestle's and...
No, because I wasn't working for a Unilever, that's why I'm asking, so it wasn't as big as that, that's why.
Yeah.
My view of that, and I'll tie it into a few of the issues, because we've jumped around a bit in the last 5 minutes, everyone is, and I heard this quote recently and I loved it, everyone is part of everyone else's supply chain. I do think actually when it comes to SMEs, my view is it's more to your point about the future. I think that is one of the things that's part of the future. Certainly in my practice, I don't see much movement from SMEs, but that might be part of the self-selection group of clients that we work with. Investors cannot be ignored in the future. If we're talking about sort of recent examples of work that we've been involved in, an investor who had just bought 10%, it was a private equity house, had just bought a 10% stake in an organization. Once they'd bought in, said, you need to reform your labour welfare policies and procedures, and if you don't, we will publicly vote against you personally, you the board, personally criticise the CEO, and we're going to raise this at the AGM. And that we haven't seen much before, but I think this will be part of the growing trend, and that will apply equally to SMEs as it will to bigger companies. And what Larry Fink said at Davos with his open letter about the link between sustained financial performance and societal impacts is increasingly being seen by investors as important.
Okay,
and that should be borderline.
Just like to move on to some of the questions from the audience there. And the first one summarised is that balance between being able to prioritise but also being able to answer the NGO or the activist question about why don't you know everything. Is there any simple solution to that, or any sort of examples of someone who's done that well?
I don't know whether there's a simple solution, but I think the salience approach that I mentioned, that you can, understand better through the reporting framework, is defendable.
It's more credible.
So you say, for now we're focusing on this.
Yep.
We want to. It might be narrower but deeper, and then we will turn our attention to the next thing. You need to obviously invest in the way you communicate, the dialogues you're having, and ideally you need to be doing enough, up front, the work, so that you don't get to that conversation later down the line.
To get that balance.
So,
yes,
okay.
and I think, this is something we spend a lot of time with companies on, because exactly, everything is in your supply chain, everyone's in everyone else's supply chain, and actually spending the time to work out what it is with a defensible strategy. As you said, there's no sort of hard and fast way to do it. There's lots of resources out there to work out what those issues are, is key. And then the one thing is being then confident about that plan, and not, there will always be issues that will come up. There will always be interests that are going to be different than what you prioritize. So having a mechanism to listen to that, but at the same time to say, this is what we're doing. This is what we believe is the strong thing for us to do. This is what we've heard is the right thing for us to do. And it's like what's that story about the soldiers that were lost in the mountain, and they found a map and they came down the mountain. So they found the map, so the map was like their plan. So they decided this was the plan they're going to use. They get down to the bottom of the mountain, and they've succeeded. And they realized the map was not the map of their mountain. It was actually a different mountain. But there's something in that about, no one else knows the story, obviously. No. I think it's a great story. It's like I don't know if it's World War I or World War II, and I don't know what country it was. But anyway, this is, I don't know, some kind of myth. But it's this idea of get your plan in order. It needs to be a defensible plan, and then act on it. And then along the way, you can get feedback. But, we spend so many companies just spending years working it out instead of actually acting. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
The word defensible is key there, and that's where you get back to effective human rights due diligence. Whether you're talking about legal expectations, when we talk about the rise of the claims against multinational companies, which I can talk about, but you probably don't want me to.
Not now.
That human rights due diligence does lend itself towards discharging that responsibility, whether it's a legal standard or whether it's the social expectation.
So to pick up on one of those questions there, why
a good
is it
case
not
study,
law?
A good case study is, and this highlights, and probably goes to your point, I was speaking to a construction company recently who was saying that, look, when you take something like granite, which you can mine in India, children are involved in granite mines in India, we all know that, and that ends up in Surrey on someone's kitchen countertop. That's actually a relatively linear supply chain process. But if you compare that to, say, the construction of a drill, which has many different parts in it, and each of those different parts have their own supply chain, it just highlights the complexity, which is why when it comes to, what's defensible, it is about sort of the reasonable, when we talk about within reason, that's ultimately highlighting the challenges and how in the one context it might be unreasonable for you not to know, but in the other, if you can show that you actually are aware of the issues and you've done as much as you can. Nestle is an interesting example. So Nestle have recently insourced all of their, because we shared a panel with them at the UN Forum, and one of the things that the General Counsel said was they've insourced all of their procurement to one company in Switzerland. Which from a legal point of view is actually, Switzerland has pretty strong extraterritorial laws, which means that company, if there are issues in the supply chain somewhere else in the world, would potentially create a legal risk for them in terms of the claims. And yet the effective management of those human rights issues is so much more important in terms of managing their organization that they've decided to take that step. Now, evidently not all companies can afford to do that, and you'll need to have procurement sites around the world.
So
can I just add that, when it's defensive, it may be okay for you to say, for now, we're focusing on China. And because we need to get to grips with this, so you could carve your strategy that way, or for now we're focusing on this.
So I think the message would be, don't wait too long analysing all your different impacts, but actually say, this is at this point in time what we think are our salient impacts, and we're going to crack on and do something. and then whilst you're doing that, have a broader look at what you're doing. And I think the answer that I heard a bit of in terms of why is this not law, well, the UN can't actually make law, but in creating the guiding principles, what they're encouraging is a direction, and that is increasingly being now implemented as law in various different cases, such as that's been...
It's considered soft law because it's... but there is a reason why John Ruggie chose to go that way, and that he knew how long it would take if he went the law way.
And actually a number of elements of it already in law, so a number of things already happening, it's just a few extra bits in that more holistic approach.
From a tort law perspective, it is potentially, over the years to come, an emerging standard in terms of duty of care as well, which at the moment the Guiding Principles is a very high-level document. But when you ultimately see an organisation which is doing nothing, and you speak to the board and you look at cases like Caremark, which highlight the importance of the board actually knowing about these issues, is the board conversant in these issues? It becomes much more difficult to defend those sorts of claims if the answer is no. And if you have standards which are ultimately just lip service.
Yeah, okay. Any guidance for the retailers? How can they guard against inadvertently worsening the situation or increasing the
I think there are some helpful examples to look at.
Things all the like conversations have been about brands, but retailers must be equally susceptible, if not more.
Yes, I think
contributing to these things.
I mean, some of the examples to look at are things like global framework agreements.
Which is for those
so a global framework agreement is really about protecting the interests of workers working for multinational companies, and they're negotiated between global level unions and the company. And interesting examples are of companies, for instance, we've worked with, again, our H&M, Inditex, Web Zara, and at the practical level what it means is that for instance, H&M signed a global framework agreement with Industrial, which is a global union, in 2015, and that looked to protect 1.6 million workers across, I don't know how many, over 1,500 factories. And as a result of that, some examples which you can read in H&M's reporting is, for instance, that they've set up national monitoring committees in countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Turkey, which included both the unions and representatives from H&M. They've come into, they've had other positive impacts. For instance, examples like in Myanmar, when conflicts arose in a textile garment factory, and the workers were actually fired as a result of a strike, then this engaged Industrial and H&M to try and reinstate those workers, and ultimately they joined the union. So some really interesting examples out there.
Tara, anything else you've come across for retailers?
Well, I mean, I guess maybe the obvious example, when we're talking about collaboration, we've talked a little bit about collaboration or partnership or collective solutions, so whatever you want to frame it as. But I think in terms of the Global Social Compliance Program, as usual, being a place... oh no, sorry, the Consumer Goods Forum. Yes. I will. That just betrayed how long I've been doing this. The Consumer Goods Forum, which has actually identified what the most salient human rights issue is for the retailers. For retailers. So that's an obvious one to say. Well,
good
if you're not, good starting point. So I think that would be probably the only example that would really have to be useful right now. Yeah.
Anything to add, or should we?
I would just very briefly leave it as actually the retail sector is quite lucky insofar as it's got a lot of collective action initiatives going on, like ETI, and those are great.
And ETI,
Action, collaboration, transformation.
Okay, lovely. I've got 2 minutes left, so we'll just try and pick up a couple more of these questions.
Just got
a question from the audience. Yeah. Right, lovely, thank you. I had trouble with that app as well, actually, so I'm with you.
Yeah, it didn't work.
Have we got a microphone there?
Yeah, we do. Can you hear me, David? Yeah.
Yes.
It's another question linked to the retailer query, actually.
Sure.
I was just wondering whether you've got some real practical examples of grievance mechanisms working down the supply chain, because this is something that we're looking into from a retailer perspective, but the fact is, even at a tier 1 level, I walk into a factory and there's all of my competitors' lines for the workers. So the risk that you run is the workers won't know which line to call, they're not going to, everyone has a different approach. And then in the end, it's so confusing for the workers.
Isn't
if
there
they
just one
had
line
an issue
for everybody to phone?
Who do they call?
Well, we have a very clear vision for this, and I would love to, I'm going to get the legal perspective on whether this would work, or actually in your perspective as well, Susanna. Because I think this is one of those areas where, from my perspective, I don't think it's actually every company's job to go and establish grievance mechanisms that are going to work in every part of their supply chain. What I think the idea is actually to create effective grievance mechanisms at every level in the supply chain, so that you would say, your suppliers need to have an effective grievance mechanism, and their suppliers need to have an effective grievance mechanism.
It doesn't always have to come back up to the
No,
retailer.
but what you still need is an effective way of collecting information when it's relevant to you. And so that's the piece I recognize is tricky, but I think if we can get that vision in our head of people owning, the grievances of the people who are within their workers and their own community rights holders, then we're going to be setting ourselves up for success instead of putting all of the burden on multinational or very large organizations, which,
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on practical grievance mechanisms?
Something, and this is a grievance mechanism which does go all the way sort of to the top, which I think is quite interesting, is the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Safety, which follows the Rana Plaza incident, has an arbitration provision, and we go back to the point, it's a voluntary initiative. So if you sign up to the Bangladesh Accord, you sign up to the arbitration provisions within that. And the obligations of the Bangladesh Accord include making sure that your suppliers sign up to and adhere to certain policies and procedures. And there are two companies who are anonymous, because part of the arbitration process is that you don't disclose who's going to arbitration, have failed to do that. And so two trade unions have commenced the arbitration procedure, and that arbitration has to be accepted in The Hague, and that will proceed. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that's one interesting development which I could see sort of being replicated in other contexts. The other issue with grievance mechanisms in the supply chain is we have a lot of trouble enough with audits. So there are methodological issues with audits that really, and we can, in terms of issues around sort of announced visits and all those sorts of things, which have led to, for example, the KIT case and the Loblaws case, where actually audits were carried out. And yet they failed to identify the issues. So the grievance mechanism the grievance mechanism issue, and trying to make sure they're effective, going back to GP31, says we're going to suffer, we're going to really have to grapple with this hard, because ultimately it'll suffer from many of the same issues in terms of speak up and close relationships between the people who run the factory and the workers and all those sorts of issues.
Emily, does that answer your question? Yeah, I think that's the key point.
And
It's
you should
then
be
about how do you
staffing
collect
it.
Yeah.
So if you are only going to rely on a hotline, which is not necessarily the only way, it shouldn't be enough. I mean, you need to think of other ways. But if you are only going to rely on that, then do make sure that you've thought through, because I was involved in this in my previous organization, you've thought through the back end of it about when that grievance comes in, how it's going to escalate, who's responsible, the people taking in those things, that they understand what the issues are, because it's all well and good having a hotline, but if you haven't thought about the back end, it can stay there. You were talking about corrective action.
So one final point, just to kind of sum up in terms of human rights made simple from the panel. And Stuart, if you sort of make that point, but wrap it into your sort of final
just
thoughts.
One final point on that question before I flow in. It's also important to involve local NGOs and trade unions as well. I think there's the difference between the international NGOs, which are great, but ultimately the local NGOs do have naturally the ears close to the ground. In terms of sort of the human rights made simple, I think I'll go back to a point I said at the very beginning, which is ultimately my view of the UN Guiding Principles, I may be corrected, is that it's about a standard of conduct, and the central component to that is that unless you assess your human rights issues, then you ultimately will not be sure that you have a program which is responding to your key issues naturally. And because this is an outcomes-based thing, the program will be insufficient.
Okay, thank you. Susannah?
So I think hopefully one thing that you've taken away from today is the concept of prioritization. If I had known about it better in my previous role, it would have made my life a lot easier rather than trying to respond to everything that was being thrown at me. So really having a considered way based on severity to people is really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm kind of building in the same theme, don't get overwhelmed and build on what you're already doing. I think that, hopefully, if anything, we've maybe demystified some things, but also, we are already, the people in this room anyway, are mostly already doing a lot. So this is building on that,
Lovely. Thank you very much. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you.
It's very difficult to get three people with brains the size of planets to still a 45-minute discussion. And thank you very much to you as audience for the questions.
Thank
and
you.
we're now having a break, I believe.